Let's talk about the recent debacle, so to say, of what is happening against the backdrop of the 30th Nigeria Economic Summit, because the World Bank stands on Nigeria's economic reforms despite the growing hardship in the country has become rather a sore talking point. And we ask the question, are these tough policies truly the path to prosperity? We're going to be talking to a professor of economics at the Ahmed University in Zaria, Kaduna State. Professor Muttaka Ahmed is joining us on the program tonight, and we'll also be speaking to an investigative journalist and, of course, international affairs commentator David Hundeyin, who will be joining the conversation virtually to add value to all of these perspectives. But we have here with us in the studio Professor Muhammad Muttaka. Prof, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on Daily Politics tonight. Now, where do you stand on these advisories by these Bretton Woods institutions? Because it has become a polarizing talking point. Whenever the World Bank or IMF speaks, it does appear that Nigerians feel different about their views. Recently, we had a senior vice president of the World Bank say, listen, Nigeria needs to stay the course for the next 15 years. And it drew quite the reaction from the audience at the summit. Safe to say that they think, regardless of the economic pains, the impact on the lives and livelihood of Nigerians, this direction that we currently are on is the best way forward. Where do you stand on this note?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think even where the words were said, there was a bit row on that. Mark you, Nigerian Economic Summit groups are not closely economists, but they are organized private sector, decide to organize themselves and try to provide solutions. But let's just take it back and explain how all this happens. This advice normally comes to Nigeria for over close to 40 years, 38 years now. And all those advice, whenever they give those advice, Nigerians knows that there is going to be more hardship, because in most cases, those advice are take line, hook and sinker without evidence. Because somebody in economics, anything that you are going to say, anything that you are going to explain must have an evidence base. Evidence to do with what are we expecting, because it's a science that you look at the economy itself. What happened if I withdrew subsidy, supposedly in quote, because for some of us we believe there wasn't any subsidy, but there are corruptions on the industry, as it were. Then you open up the market for foreign exchange, and that's obviously, for an economist, you will be able to say that this what are going to happen in the next 1 to 3 years. But in this case, they are our creditors. So they give us money and said, this is what you are going to do, A, B, C, there. Therefore, they have to make you believe that whatever they said is to their own interest. By the way, all this World Bank, we are member countries of World Bank and IMF, but it does not mean that we have a major say in it. Therefore, they give us rules and regulations and conditions, and we follow it. And when you look at it, there is nowhere in the world where these policies provide a succor to any. Let me give you an example. In Latin America, the entire Latin America were being like a laboratory for World Bank and IMF with their policies. They put in all their structural program in those countries. And up to today, with the exception of Brazil, who turned back and said, look, these policies are not helping us, we are going to change the directions, and indeed, they came out of where they are. If you take Argentina and the rest, they are still in problem.
Okay, Prof, a lot of people will say we can cherry pick other bad examples as well, those who have ignored some of these advisories and have gone downhill, economies like Venezuela, for instance, and the rest. I mean, you could also talk about some of the economic sanctions that have helped push those economies in those particular direction. But let's bring David into the conversation. David, good evening, and thank you most kindly for joining us. I would like to get your take. I mean, your position on this is quite clear. Anyone who's been tracking or following your post online pretty much know where you stand. But are these advisories inherently bad, or are we just bad at implementing them?
So it's not so much an issue of whether they're inherently bad or not, but it's more of an issue of what the motivation is behind these policy recommendations that are constantly made by the IMF and the World Bank. The most important thing to understand about these institutions is that these are American institutions. These are global banks, American banks that work for American and global investment interests. The purpose of these institutions is not to develop Nigeria or to develop Africa. The purpose of these institutions is to make a profit. These are for-profit institutions. So there's always, as my co-panelist very correctly said, this set of recommendations has been made in Nigeria before. Roughly I think it was during the Babangida administration when the recommendation was made, amongst other things, to defund higher education, basically defund pretty much the entire industrialization push that the Nigerian at the time. Because if you recall, I mean, you were around at the time, it said that, between the 70s and the 80s, Nigeria was on the cusp of becoming Africa's first industrialized economy. And then the IMF came in and said, no, defund everything. That what the world needs from you is crude oil and cashew nuts and oil palms, raw material exports. So boost your raw material exports and defund everything else. Everything else has to suffer to boost your exports, because by boosting those exports, then you will be able to earn dollars, which you can then use to repay your loans. So the only purpose of these policies is to make it more possible for you to earn dollars with which to repay loans, so that the shareholders of these institutions can make a profit. It has nothing to do with the actual effect of these policies on the ground. That's the most important thing to understand about them. And the proof of this is that every single time that they have been implemented, these so-called structural adjustment policies, the IMF or the World Bank always inevitably comes out a few years later and says, oh, actually, sorry, it turns out that the implementation failed horribly, and the reason it failed, I'm quoting this directly from an article that I'm reading in front of me now. What the title of the article is World Bank Admits Mistake in SAP Implementation. And what was the mistake here? The World Bank says that it didn't take into account that Africa has certain social priorities, social context, that it only took economic factors into consideration, which means, as I've been saying, that the only factor that was taken into consideration was that this is what needs to be done to boost your dollar earnings so that you can send money to these institutions, you can repay your loans, and they can make a profit. The actual devastation and damage that it causes on the ground is completely ignored. From the point of view of these institutions, whether 50 million Nigerians starve to death as a result of these so-called shock therapy policies, is completely immaterial. Everything is just a series of ones and zeros. Everything is a calculation on a spreadsheet.
Right.
So if that calculation means that millions of Nigerians have to die, it's completely unimportant to them. So again, I'm not saying that these are good or bad in and of themselves, but I'm saying that it's very important that from a Nigerian policy point of view, we understand that these institutions do not exist for our benefit. So we have to figure out where our own interest lies before sort of swallowing everything hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah. Okay. And isn't it also a fact to point out that regardless of who is in charge, regardless of the advice or who is giving it, that the road to recovery for the Nigerian economy and the Nigerian people is going to be a Herculean one, a very difficult one. Sacrifices have to be made, whether it's the advice is coming from the World Bank or coming from IMF or any other international or domestic institution. Is there anything out of the ordinary from what these institutions are telling our government?
So, I mean, they certainly do have some good recommendations sometimes. So they recommend efficiency cuts in the public service. So parts of the public sector which are bloated. I think we all agree that parts of the public sector in Nigeria are heavily bloated. That's why we have things like the Oronsai report, which still hasn't been implemented. So there's nothing about that. We know that certain reforms have to be made. But the point is, if we're implementing these reforms, we need to have had a local perspective on these things to confirm that these things are actually in our interest to do, so that we don't just end up swallowing wholesale something that some white guy said, because some white guy said it somehow makes it true and somehow makes it beneficial for us. No. And I feel very strongly about this, because maybe if you had asked me this question 4 or 5 years ago, I'd have given you a completely different answer, because I was once upon a time very, very much into the sort of Chicago school of economics. But events over the past sort of half decade have given me a very, very different view on how the world actually works. So it's important that, whether they're making good or bad recommendations, we are filtering everything locally, so that we have our own, highly qualified, economic experts and researchers who are in a position to be able to tell the government whether such and such thing is actually in our interests or not. And then we implement the parts of these things that are beneficial to us and discard the ones that aren't. We don't just end up swallowing someone else's recommendations and then becoming someone's experiment, which, as the gentleman rightly said, has been done in South America, has been done in Africa, has even been done in Nigeria previously, and we're still suffering the consequences of something that happened before I was born.
All right. So, Prof, let's bring you back here in the studio. Why do our leaders continuously listen or perhaps give audience to these advisories if the jury is out on its quote-unquote, lack of popularity with the Nigerian population? Why does it appear that our leaders keep listening to some of these advisories? Because I suppose for the Tinubu administration, this is a thumbs up from the World Bank that you are on the right track, irrespective of what the people are saying about these economic reforms.
I think we have to share all the blame, because even we in the research field, we sometimes overlook so many things and keep quiet. And so also the journalists, they don't ask right questions as it were. What is it? All history has shown that any government that have a backing of the World Bank, they are doing bad to their nationals. And all what is happening now is against the Nigerian Constitution. If you go to the Nigerian Constitution as amended 1999, chapter 2 of the Constitution, the economic objective of the state, it shows that all the policies that you are going to do must reflect the social well-being of the citizen. So therefore, it's talking about the sovereignty here. As a nation, we have a constitution, we bow to those constitutions, but that constitution is neglected because of the certain interest of somebody outside as a creditor. Because all what he is interested in is how are you going to pay back the loan? And that's a business for over 3 decades now. So it is not just to say that it's a thumb up. No, but rather, even the people who invited them to come and address, I think they should rethink about it, because they are the private sector, they are in the industry, they are in the manufacturing. By the time this economy continue as it were, they will close shop, and then their capital is going down. If you take now the small-scale industry that's closed up as a result of these policies, it will be really a bad situation.
Just in less than 10 seconds, Prof, can Nigeria afford to turn back from these institutions?
Absolutely. There is history that shows that.
Without repercussions?
Whatever repercussions is your own nation. You are a sovereign country. You can make decisions about your country and to hell with anybody outside this country.
Right.
Yes.
That's quite daring.
Yes.
David, you're going to have the last word very briefly. What do you think? Can we afford to turn away from these institutions and find our own way?
I think we can't afford to follow the advice of these institutions, because already our economy is crumbling under the advice of these institutions. So the question should actually be inverse.
All right. Okay, gentlemen, interesting conversation, but I'm afraid we're going to have to end it here. Thank you both for joining the conversation and for your insight on this all-important conversation.
Thank you, Bob.
Right, and that is our show for you tonight. Thank you most kindly for joining us. Daily Politics will be back tomorrow live at 8 p.m. Until next time, my name is Abdullahi Ahmed. Good evening.